This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
It's Community Pulse on Radio 786 100.4 FM. Thank you for joining us for this morning segment, of course, as we're continuing on the journey towards unmasking bullying. It's been fascinating, really fascinating. We remind you and invite you once again, if you're not following us on or subscribing to our YouTube channel, please do yourself a favor and go and search for Radio 786. All of these previous segments are available there. Go and revisit if you have listened to it. Every time I listen to it, I seem to learn something new. Of course, we have been for the past few weeks speaking to clinical psychologist Daniel Den Hollander. Today we are joined by Qureisha Bake as well. She is a clinical psychologist. She's based in KZN. And just to sort of bring you up to speed with the past few weeks, we said and we call this a journey because we realize there's no quick fix. There's no there's no plaster we can put. We don't want to put a plaster on this whole situation. But there's not going to be any quick fix. That as a society, we understand that a lot of the incidents that we've seen playing out on our social media platforms is really but a snapshot of what's happening within our community, what's happening in society. And in fact, I'd even venture to say what's happening globally, because it just reminds us of so many parts of ourselves that we need to constantly introspect and interrogate about. So yes, we speak about bullying, but we also understand that a part of the human condition being the fact that we accumulate as we go along, and where we are and what we are at particular times, it's shaped and informed by our circumstances, shaped and informed by our past. We've dug a little bit within our South African past. We looked and we recognized the fact that colonialism played such an impactful and integral role in how we see the world. We understand that race, class and gender, and we recognize that race, class and gender, how that shapes and informs how we traverse the world and how we journey through the world. And yes, then we narrow it down into these microcosms, within our society in Cape Town, and then we go into our familial spaces, and we need to constantly do the hard work, and we need to understand many, and again, I'm going to invite you, because this conversation has been so big, I'm going to invite you to revisit the previous segments. Of course, we first spoke about what bullying is, and we realized we can't narrow it down to a particular definition. We tried a little bit, to look at some of the integral or the important points to look at. We looked at the movement towards counterculture to bullying. We've also last week looked at what's happening in our schools, and we were reminded of the fact that having policies in place is not enough, because we need to self-regulate. That's what there needs to be a mind shift in as far as that is concerned. Today we are turning our attention to parents, and we see how oftentimes that parents go into two very sort of different human reactions. Fierce protectiveness if my child was hurt, and a deep defensiveness if my child caused the harm. Now, both of these responses we recognize come from love mixed with fear, but what we sometimes forget is that our children reflect the emotional tone of our homes back to us, not because we're bad parents or because we are the best of parents, but because our kids absorb how we fight, how we shut down, how we handle pressure, and how we treat each other. A bully child often learns to shrink to keep the peace, and a child who bullies is usually carrying their own anger or insecurity with no outlet. And the child who stands by and says nothing is using the same survival strategy they've learned in tense or unpredictable environments. These aren't good, quote-unquote, or bad, quote-unquote, children. They are children acting out the emotional habits they've inherited. A lot said in that introduction, of course, to take us through this conversation. Daniel Den Hollander, good morning and welcome. Thank you again for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and salam to you and to the listeners.
Wa alaikum salam. Qureisha Bake, clinical psychologist based in KZN. Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me on and inviting me. I'm looking forward to this.
Daniel, I know you're going to start this conversation with us, because now we're moving into sensitive territory as well. We last week we alluded to parents. Today we're focusing there.
Yes, and I think it's the three levels. It's how do we deal with the schools, remembering that teachers are as much community members as anybody else. But today it is a sensitive conversation because I'm a parent myself, and I find it difficult to receive feedback. There's a lot of wat sal die mense sê in this conversation as well. A lot of prejudice that comes into place, and I think it is a sensitive conversation. I think one of the most interesting things about being a psychologist is you never choose who comes in and whose burden you carry. And I'm sure it's the same with Croatia as well, but we get both the parents of the children that did the bullying as well as the children who were bullied, and I think one of the most amazing and most difficult parts of being a psychologist is that your focus isn't on what happened, what was right. You don't have to elicit an affidavit. What your job is to deal with the mental health, with the healthcare, with the dignity and with the respect that every human being deserves. And that's not always an easy thing, especially in these types of conversations, especially in the conversation that often starts to happen in social media when an incident like this takes place.
Croatia, I'd like you to pick up from what Daniel said by way of an introduction, and I also just want to mention something that perhaps I didn't emphasize when we did the introduction, is that a large part of this conversation, why we speak about self-regulating, is because we do recognize the fact that we are moral beings, and we do have an innate moral compass, and how important core values, the important role that core values ought to play within these collectives, be it from the family space, and then be it when we spoke about bullies and why certain groups also bully. So by way of an introduction, I would like your the introductory comments, but also if you want to perhaps bring that into your conversation.
I think you're right. I think, the core values become such an essential part of us. And as Muslims, we often revert to Islam for our core values. And the beauty in that is that it gives us so many guidelines on approaching both the bully and the victim from a very reasonable perspective when we reflect on the sunnah. And I often say psychology and all the things we advocate in psychology are actually very Islamic principles. So I think merging the two is a real gift. I think just acknowledging what Daniel said about parenting, being a parent oneself, we've made the mistakes. And as a psychologist, as much as we have the knowledge, it's just recognizing that even though you have the knowledge, it's really difficult to implement. So just being able to empathize then with both the bully and the victim, because I think we can sometimes enact both roles. But we have real core values to go back to guide us.
And looking to again in our introduction, now this is sort of something, and Daniel, you will recall last week when we spoke to Paddy as a guidance counselor, this came in because if there's any incident at school, of course, we have the learner, we have the teacher, but then we have the parent as well. And it was so interesting around parents' responses. The fact that, yes, of course, some parents get very defensive, it's my child, and why did he or she bully? There must be a reason. Yeah. And of course, the bullied one, and I was saying, I don't want to stand there, Allah forbid, if my child is being bullied, I don't want to stand here and hear explanations, even from a psychologist as qualified as yourself, as to why somebody bullied my child. I want retribution. That's my immediate response.
Absolutely.
But then, of course, we are also concerned at the fact that many children are quiet, even if they say this now. Now, let's get to the meat of this discussion between yourself and Croatia. Parents' responses and the whys and the hows behind it, and how do we interpret those?
I think it's a very difficult situation. I think we have to acknowledge that at starters. I think let's break it down. I think about myself. I have shared on here that I experienced bullying in my childhood and my school career. And I remember that when I did tell my parents did get involved. And unfortunately, that actually made things worse because the moment that they were involved, then I was seen as somebody who couldn't fight their own fights. And the reason why it got worse was because the structures to be weren't addressing the bullying within the school structure. And I think that often becomes the problem is anger is appropriate, like we've said before. It's what we do with the anger. Look, bullying at the essence is I use physical threats and I use physical exertion, aggression, in order to sort out a system that I don't trust. And I will take it out onto another. So often with a bully, there are difficulties either in the household or there's difficulties within the community. And I need to bring back some of that power for myself. And so I do it in the form of bullying. But if the parents themselves in the anger towards that does a similar power dynamic, it doesn't help anything because we're perpetuating the behavior that we're trying to eradicate. And so what's important for that anger to do is the anger is identifying that there's a problem within the structure, within the community, the school community. And as a result, that community is no longer safe. Hence the fight-flight response. But it's the duty of the elders of the community. In this place, it would be the parents and the teachers and the headmaster to look at why that environment is not safe and to start to establish safety and security within that environment. But if that doesn't take place, like you said, if there's quick and clever answers that just serves to displace and divert and tries to make everybody happy without actually doing any kind of change, then that anger will, when you silence anger, the anger will erupt.
Kuresha, yeah, please.
I think, just to add to that we also need to just acknowledge that the anger is a completely appropriate response from the parent. I always say I can be the calmest person in every environment, but when it comes to my children, I'm the most irrational lioness that exists. But it's just a normal response and it comes from love. Then in fact, anger is usually just a reaction to a deeper hurt. And as parents, we feel hurt that our child can be put in such a helpless position. And often we'll give more airtime to the violence or the aggression, but we also need to acknowledge the violent communication that happens. Children and bullies can also be aggressive in their language, demeaning, shameful, and that also has a huge impact. And again, as parents, when we get protective, we want to do the same. We want to shame the bully. We want to shame the school. And we really have to just hold ourselves together from getting into that pattern, like Daniel says, and perpetuating then this pattern of bullying because we're modeling it. And then children watch what we model and don't always necessarily listen to what we say. They do as we do, but not as we say.
I think it's so interesting, and it feels like we need to pause on each of these responses. Even though every response in every situation would require a lot more attention, we know we don't have the luxury of time on our side. But if one thinks about the response of the parent whose child is a bully, and we know that we see again, and what triggered this is when you say the word violent now, Croatia, again we realize that we have a traumatized society.
Yeah.
And hence that every single time we start the show, there's a lot of points we ask our ask our listeners to revisit on the previous segments. But what we cannot disconnect ourselves from would be our history and our historical circumstance. Yeah. And we realize there's a lot there. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of anger, and we recognize that. So now, from the point of the parent whose child is a bully, yeah, it can be one of a few responses, and one of those responses would be to then punish that child in very violent ways. Yeah. And again, you know what? No, we don't want to validate or justify the bully acting in certain ways. But as Daniel has pointed out, and I'm sure yourself, Qureisha, as well as a psychologist, it's part of your job to understand why people behave in certain ways, yeah, and what shapes and informs their behavior. And so if one looks at that also as a possible response from parents, not to automatically be that lioness like many of us would be, or want to protect your child no matter what he or she did, but then you would also, and what does that say about how that child will then sort of, and how that child will act in the world, given that, you know, even the response to him or her inflicting violence is then inflicted on him or her?
So I think to start off with, yes, teenagers know the difference between right and wrong. But if we look at the law to the letter, and I think it is helpful in this regards, is a child might know the difference between right and wrong, but might not be able to act in accordance to that understanding. Mm-hmm. And parents have to be the regulators and the holders of the children until the child is emotionally independent, comes of age. That's very important. And on top of that, I think also, if I take the Martin Luther King quote that we said last week as well, is the difference between society and parenting is that society teaches you that there's consequences to behavior. Parenting also teaches you that there's consequences to behavior, but with compassion. And that compassion is important. And tough love is important. I still love and accept you, but I don't accept the behavior, which is important. So the problem with a punitive response would be like smacking your child because your child smacked another kid. All right. In a punitive response, the difficulty there is that often parents will do punitive discipline more out of a shame of wat sal die mense sê,
yeah,
than out of actually wanting to extinct a behavior that the child is showing. And if your response comes from shame, because there is a lot of shame involved if you find out that your child is the bully.
Yeah.
But the other side of it is that if it comes from a place of curiosity, and I think this is where psychologists come in very handy, because for a parent it can be extremely difficult to hold all of these spaces, especially with communities that are really struggling. And I think the whole of South Africa can probably fall into that bracket. That if my punishment is punitive, so, you smacked a kid and now I smack you, it doesn't restore anything back to our core value of community. We have to understand that it's not just the left hand can't know what the right hand is doing when we're giving. It's also realizing that our behaviors can either help society or help our community or take something away. But when we've taken something away, for example, the dignity and the respect of the individual that we've bullied, we have to atone for that. We cannot allow society to continue being unsafe with our behavior, knowing that other children have been watching our behavior as well. And so that's why I come back to Wahbi Long's Nation on the Couch, is that he says that the cure for guilt is acknowledgement plus atonement. I need to pay back to society what I took away.
Yeah, as you were talking, I thought about the fact that, yes, in previous episodes, of course, you've referenced the book, and it really, it's such an important factor, if one can call it that, such an important element of this conversation to consider when we talk about that. I wish we can pause a little bit longer there, Qureisha, but we want to, of course, get a sense of parents and parents' responses. When we speak about kids absorbing how we fight, how we shut down, how we handle particular situations, how we treat one another, of course, now we speak about role modeling and why our children respond in particular ways. Speak to us a little bit about the parent that, or the child then, that decides to just be quiet. I saw something, I'm not going to say something, it doesn't concern me. I haven't been bullied and I'm not the one who's doing the bullying, so let me turn away. What does that say about parents?
I think that speaks so much into the way in which we're tempted to avoid situations and not get involved. And, I think it goes back to, like you mentioned, our history and that oppressive past that we've had, knowing then that any intervention that we proceed with comes with such severe consequences, and wanting to save ourselves from that because the consequences can be harsh. And so we get torn within that space. But we've got to go back then to the values. And I think we often go back to the Sunnah, that the Prophet ﷺ never sat back. He always engaged, and he engaged with curiosity rather than shaming or discouragement. He actually advocated for us to be more involved as part of the community. And I think we need to let the children know that. We need to demonstrate that for them, because we often will watch things happening as bystanders, and now there's the culture of taking out your phone and filming it rather than actually being constructively involved. But he always highlighted that we are community, and so as a community we must get involved, otherwise we are demonstrating something in our community. So then the Prophet ﷺ used to say, help your brother, whether he is the oppressor or the oppressed. And if we leave it unchallenged, then we are not actually being part of the social accountability. We actually reinforcing that power imbalance that was created in the past, and we separating it from our ethics. So I think we have to recognize and reinforce that belonging and brotherhood that we have.
So let's move on to that, because I go back to what we said in the introduction, and something which Daniel continually reminded us of, why we don't want to have knee-jerk responses to particular visuals that we see playing out on social media, because we know as quickly as that, and unfortunately it should jolt me a lot more to say this, but the reality is we move on to the next one and the next one and the next one within days. And so he continually reminds us that all of these visuals and these videos that we see, it's but a snapshot of what's happening within our homes, within society. So let's continue on that, with that in mind, and what you've just said, the idea of the community, the idea of when you speak about the fact that, and again, previous conversations, effective communication, Daniel, not just between parent and child, between peers at school, between learner and teacher, and so there's all of this, and the idea of the community. Yeah. Where does that even start? Because we live in a world which constantly reminds us about the me, myself, and I, and my rights and my freedoms, and so we have this human-centered approach that I'm the center of the family, the center of the community, the center of the world. So how do we start that conversation?
I think the conversation's already starting. It's already there. I mean, if we look at the macro level, I mean, this whole thing that we call geopolitics is about two worldviews clashing. You know, the worldview of egocentrism, the individual, which becomes a bit of an idea of all I need to do in order to be successful is to accumulate as much wealth as possible. And then we see from the 80%, the global majority, a different worldview, community focus, building communities out of love, out of supporting each other, realizing that we're not running a race. It's more like a marathon, but a marathon where we all want to complete. And I think the difficulty is that children present a hard truth for us as parents. They often reflect through their behaviors the dynamics and the problems that we can't resolve as adults. I see it as a parent myself. The parts that I get most upset with my sons for are the parts that I feel the most shame about myself. Because my children will reflect my dynamics, half because they are my genes, but half also because they have been raised by me. And those micro teachings that I do, especially the ones unconsciously, they play back at me. And so being a parent is constantly being confronted with ourselves. But what we do is we get defensive, and we close the line off and we project, like those overhead projectors, whatever's in the middle gets projected outside. We project that discomfort back onto our children. And that is where it becomes so dangerous, because if I defend myself in that moment and not be aware, then I lose the opportunity not only to be able to communicate to my own child, but also to communicate with myself. And so that's why it's so crucially important, that line that you enjoyed from 2 sessions ago, that critical engagement is not about critically engaging with somebody else's biases, but critical engagement at its heart is to critically engage with my own biases.
I'm thinking with another mental health expert when we always speak to her, and that would come up, that the quality of your life is to a large extent determined by your relationships, but it starts with the relationship with herself, and that's such a crucial part of this conversation. Qureshi, I'd like you to pick up on some of what Daniel has said. So because we always ask the question, we don't. What does it look like in tangible terms, in material terms, and so the way we don't want these conversations to remain in the realm of the abstract. So we speak about this ideal. So for parents, when we say parents, pause, listen, and ask questions. Parents, please understand that these are not solitary journeys. What you are going through with your child, and the questions that come up, and the relationships that your child has. Now, what does this look like for parents in material terms? What ought they to do?
I mean, as parents, one of the big things we do is we immediately show our children that protective response for them. And with that can often come a very shock response and a harsh response. But then we filtering that child back into that space rather than encouraging them to speak. So I think what parents really need to do is maintain a calm tone and a curious tone, because that encourages speech rather than shutting the child down. What we want to get from our child is get all the facts. We don't want to misunderstand and then we escalate without knowing everything, and then we further perpetuate the harm. So we want to create an environment of safety, but we do that by just lowering your voice. And that's even a Quranic thing. It's written in the Quran. One of the things that they did was they say, lower your voice in order to be heard. And when we want somebody to hear us in a heated situation, we often get louder. But then the person's just thinking of their next response, or they're emotionally shutting down. Whereas if we consciously drop it a level, people strain a little bit to hear us, and then they listen. And we need to do that with our children because they're also heightened. So just a neutral tone, a softer tone, it removes that flight-fight response from the child itself, even your body posture, just sitting with curiosity, and just ask them, what happened? Who brought you here? What is it that got you to this point? What was happening before? So you ask the clarifying questions. What were you feeling before this happened? If your child was the bully, what was happening before you lashed out? What were you feeling? What were you experiencing? And then clarify. Was there something that is unsaid? Was it fear? Or did I understand you correctly? What's missing from this? What's the real point of disagreement here? So that we really get a response from the child. Because what we're doing now is we're working off this community that we're creating online, gathering more anger and responses from them. And we're actually looking to have a louder voice by getting the support. But then again, we're responding from that larger community, that larger voice, the one who has more status, the one who has more money. And we need to really bring it down to a level of evenness.
Yeah.
So we really want to just then encourage that for our children and model that for our children, because this is a great opportunity for us to model problem solving for them and effective problem solving that they'll take into the future, into their workplaces. So we just want to really model that for them by that empathy, by that responsibility, by that gentleness. And especially if the child is the bully, making them recognize the child itself is not the problem. The behavior is the problem. So separating the behavior from the identity of the child. I think that's such an important thing.
Yeah, and theoretically we know that absolutely is as it should be. In practical terms, we recognize the fact that it's very difficult to do that after coming back from a hard day at work and having navigated traffic and oh my word, what am I still going to cook for supper? And there's 3-4 other siblings, so we recognize that. But we say if we don't have the intention and if we don't start somewhere, then it's never going to happen. So let us start with the intention. But also I think a very important part of what you said now goes back to something Daniel alluded to in previous conversations and earlier on also when we speak about the idea of the collective, because this is not a family standing alone. This is not a child standing alone. We are part of something so much bigger, and it goes back to earlier on when we spoke about core values, when we spoke about values that transcend time and space and that could help us with those difficulties and those burdens that we carry when we think about race, a community that's raced and that's classed and that's gendered to the extent. To what extent would you encourage that as well, or speak for that as well, Daniel? Communities reconnecting. Parents understanding that this is not a fight that we're constantly fighting alone. And you speak about utilizing this as strategy, not as conflict necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty comes in that a lot of the interventions always seems to come in an adversary way. Like the school governing body that feels more like a courtroom than a community space. And that as a result of that, we are up against each other. But within a community sense, there is then space, as Croatia quite importantly stated, there is a space in order to collectively start to think about stability and security.
Yeah.
You see, at the heart of the child who's being bullied, there's two things that needs to take place. There needs to we often think of the second one first. The second part is there needs to be healing that takes place, and that healing must also include anger. And I see so often that when that healing includes anger, there's a judgment almost on the anger. But the first part is no child will heal unless their environment becomes stable and secure. That's often why people often come into therapy in their 30s and their 40s, because that's the first time that they feel safe enough to deal with the traumas. And that is an absolute blight on society. And you cannot create stability and security within a school setting or within a community without the community. It's everybody's responsibility. Hence why we say that every child is your child. Every child is my child. I have many mothers and I have many fathers. And I must say, I've said it before, there's that I come from the Netherlands, and so my early reference of parenting was my Dutch family. And the first time that I saw Dutch parenting in South Africa was when I came and lived here, where there was this understanding of every single person was my mother and my father and could tell me off, but there was always compassion. And I had so many people adding their 2 cents in that allowed me to develop into a person that I am. And that isiZulu understanding of, as I'm sitting here, I'm not sitting here as one person. I'm sitting here as the influence of all these people that came there before me. But I think that that's exactly where the difficulty in this whole thing lies, is we need to be able to realize that our kids are the mirror. So our child is a mirror of myself, but our children is a mirror of how we are in society. That there's a lot of bullying going on within our communities, within our workplaces, that we expect ourselves as individuals to come up with a solution in order to do so, but we can't. We need to come back collectively. But that requires all of us to return back into our community core values, solidarity, of pride and dignity. Infuse yourself with pride and dignity. It requires to swallow our egos and become, instead of having to state and put our flag in the ground, to come into a place of curiosity, compassion, interests, and very importantly, that all communities in Cape Town need to understand that we are brothers and sisters of each other. And until that happens, we're going to have this over-reliant dependency on the ministers, and which we'll talk about in the next segment, with the ministers and with the authorities, that they must solve this problem for us. And it doesn't work. It's not Afrocentric. It doesn't talk back to our community values. It's us. That was the beauty also of our communities. Our solidarity is what protected us from apartheid, and solidarity is what will protect us now in this fight that we find ourselves in 2025.
And Daniel, I think you're just highlighting that the importance of communal reform projects. I think, like you highlighted, when we grew up, we didn't just have one parent as a role model. We had a community where we could walk in and any parent would feed us and any parent would guide us. But that really gave us diversity and integration into our thought patterns with these variety of role models. And that integrated this greater whole. And we need to revive that community spirit. So even for these children involved, the bullying or the bully or the victim, that community spirit and getting them involved in that community service again, I think would be such a vital part, that exposure to so many different role models.
I wish we had more time and that we can continue that, because what you're saying now, Qureisha and Daniel, that in and of itself would be a few conversations. Again, it's not about romanticizing a past. That absolutely right, Qureisha and Daniel, that one could see the communal and the power of the collective, and the power of and nowadays when one thinks about power, you think about it as hierarchical, as we've spoken about before. But when one speaks about, I mean in terms of the humanity and the healing that one sees, because now there's so much damage control. I listened to when Qureisha said earlier on about even the tone that one ought to speak in, and that in and of itself would be, from what I've gathered from what you've said, Qureisha, and that enables healing for the parent as well. Sitting quietly and pausing and looking towards oneself. But we live in this world that just everything seems to be stacked against you, and so it really makes one realize again how important it is that we take ownership of our behaviors, and we start this when we speak about the movement. So perhaps in the last minute or two, Daniel, I'm going to give you the closing comments.
You know, I don't know why, but the Trojan came up a lot this week in my own world therapy room, and it was important that there was 3,000 people at that funeral, and the song that they chose to sing was Michael Jackson, "Heal the World." And I'm really hoping I remembered that correctly. It says something. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there. You, as a good psychologist, you can connect the dots.
Yeah, I think after having spoken to you for 1 or 2 weeks, so Qureisha, he's generously left you a minute then to, if you would like to give your concluding comments, please.
I think you're right. I think, we're stuck in this survival mode with all of these constant pressures. And I think we just need to be able to make time to care for ourselves as well, make ourselves feel safer, and healing ourselves and making time for ourselves is what allows us to be effective caregivers. So saying no without guilt, asking for help, resting when we need it, all of these things are going to give us more space and capacity. And I think there's so many rituals that can ground us that are just a protective moment. So we only need to take on what we can sustain and make sure that we manage from there. Heal ourselves before we try to heal others.
And this idea of the collective, it's such a, it's for me, it's such an integral part again of this conversation, because we spoke briefly about, the spiritual aspect, and as faith communities, understanding the value within that, understanding the value of being part of something bigger, and not standing isolated and feeling like everything is just so fragmented. It just leads to feelings of depletion and feelings of sort of, one just feels resigned to this is how things are. Qureisha, we say thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights, and of course just reminding us again, you're in a different province, but so much of this plays out in similar ways. Qureisha, of course, the clinical psychologist, she's based in the UKZN, and Daniel Den Hollander, he's based here in Cape Town, clinical psychologist as well. To both of you, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
I can't believe that our time flies. We've been, of course, journeying through unmasking bullying with those experts that I just introduced to you. Thank you so much for joining us for another edition. Stay with us on 100.4 FM. And just a reminder that the previous segments all up on our YouTube channel. Stay with us. It's 100.4 FM.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.